Newly acquired wideout Cedrick Wilson has quickly risen to the top of the wide receiver 3 conversation. We got all that and a little bit of lanyap for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints, is a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network on SI. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, I'm going to give you a little bit of insight, really a lot of insight, that I got from Derrick Foster, New Orleans Saints running back coach, and how he chooses to lead by listening over anything else. We're also going to dive into how the offensive line and defensive line looked, where we got to finally see a little bit of rotation on the offensive line, which is important ahead of those padded practices coming up next week. And I want to kick everything off taking a look at newly acquired wide receiver Cedrick Wilson Jr., who has quickly risen to the top of the wide receiver 3 conversation. And don't worry, we got our dog of the day for you as well. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the Locked On Saints podcast, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. In today's episode of Locked On Saints, brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs want to help you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster and for free. So head over to linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. New Orleans Saints wide receiver Cedrick Wilson is the guy so far early on in training camp that has clearly become the third wide receiver option behind the New Orleans Saints star dynamic tandem of Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, who have shown a lot of great things throughout training camp, by the way, when it comes down to them being able to produce beyond the big, deep threat, dynamic, vertical threats that they have already proven that they can be. We're going to break down some of their stuff as well. But I wanted to start off here with Cedrick Wilson, because for me, it was always going to be between Cedrick Wilson and A.T. Perry. The large part of the conversation, at least, was going to be around them as the guys that were set up to become the, I'm going to be careful about how I use this phrase, but wide receiver 3. And what I really mean is the third option at wide receiver. Now, these things can change based upon you want somebody in the slot, maybe you want somebody outside, and all these other things. That's why I'm really cautious about like the wide receiver 3 tag, because it gives everybody sort of a depiction about this person lining up in a specific spot. That's not really what we're seeing. What we're seeing from Cedrick Wilson is that he has simply been the guy that lines up with Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed more times than not. And he's certainly been the guy outside of Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed that has been making the plays at wide receivers so far. Now, again, it is early here in training camp. The first 2 days of camp were very run game focused. It wasn't really until day 3, that they really started to open up the passing game a little bit. So this was the real opportunity for him on Friday to be able to start to distance himself. And he did that effectively, right? Contested catch, big time, kind of diving, had to go almost full horizontal to make a catch over really, really good coverage by Kool-Aid McKinstry, New Orleans Saints rookie corner, who was drafted in the second round of this year's draft. He also continued to work beyond a play that didn't get blown dead. And because of that, when the defense kind of lacked off on the back end because they thought that the play was going to be blown dead because of a sack in the backside, you saw a lot of players just kind of not necessarily feel like they had to play through the rest of the play and things like that. But the play never got blown dead. The offense continued to work, which is pretty customary when it comes to training camp. And then because of that, Derek Carr is able to find Cedrick Wilson down the right sideline for what would have been a wide open touchdown. And even though that play would have been blown dead much earlier because it was clearly a sack by Carl Granderson, the wherewithal to keep working, to keep pushing, to keep going through, quote unquote, the whistle, right? It's practice. Is it really a whistle? But continue to work through the whistle is something that shows you good work ethic. And that's something that reads to coaches. A lot of coaches complimented him right after that play because he kept working. And that is a big thing that they want to see from players throughout training camp. The ball doesn't stop moving. The play doesn't stop moving until everything is done. And that is something that we've always seen at training camp. So you're seeing him kind of show these good assets, these good traits, but that he's also going out there and making plays. And I think one of the other reasons why he's been a standout so far is because of what he can do from the slot. If you think about where Klint Kubiak just came from, the San Francisco 49ers, one of the players that they really relied on over on the offensive side of the football was wide receiver Juwan Jennings. Not only did they like him as a receiver, and even in the Super Bowl when he actually threw a touchdown, but they love him as a blocker as well. And you get some similar play from Cedrick Wilson too. We always talked about over the course of the offseason that Juwan Jennings would be a great target for the New Orleans Saints. They were not able to bring him in because of the fact that Jennings was a restricted free agent with the San Francisco 49ers. So he had no real ability to kind of go anywhere. And especially when the 49ers did put their tender down on him, did work out a longer term deal, all that stuff, he never really got the opportunity to even hit the market for the New Orleans Saints to maybe even say, hey, we got an old friend of yours in Klint Kubiak in the building. So what did the New Orleans Saints do? They go out and they get that type of receiver. Sometimes it's the archetype that you want more than it is the specific receiver, or just as much as it is the specific receiver. So I think that the Saints ended up going after Cedrick Wilson because they want that mold, that big-bodied slot receiver who will fight to make plays, who will be able to operate with his short area quickness, especially at his size, box out corners and defenders because of his size, solid hands, good route running, and can contribute as a blocker for you as well, especially in these wide zone systems that want to try to get outside of those tackles, that want to get to the sideline, and allows you to be able to expand your run protection beyond those two tackles and tight ends when you have those wide receivers that can do it. As we always say, no block, no rock. And this is a guy that's showing you that he can do both. So I love what we're seeing so far from Cedrick Wilson. Now, A.T. Perry's made a couple of plays as well, done a good job of finding open holes in the zone. But right now, we're watching A.T. Perry operate a lot with the third and second teams. He moves up into the first team every now and then. We've certainly seen that. But Cedrick Wilson's been the key guy, or at least the guy that we most typically see working with Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. And if we look at how Chris Olave's role has grown, which is one where he's not just this vertical threat, but he's being relied upon in the short and intermediate areas. Same thing for Rashid Shaheed, whose role has changed dramatically. Now, don't get me wrong. He's still a speedy, deep threat. Him and Jake Haener actually, hooking up on a big post play down the middle of the field in 7-on-7s. That's still going to be a part of his game. But all of the other things that he can do and all the other ways that he can contribute are becoming clearer. Having him run these over routes where he gets to utilize his speed laterally, crossing the field, forcing defenders to trail behind him, as opposed to them being able to play over the top of him. Being able to run these drag routes close in the short area as well. It's where you have the opportunity to get him the ball in space as he crosses the formation, and then you allow him to turn into a returner with the ball in his hand. You complement that with a big-bodied, good-handed possession guy like what Cedrick Wilson can operate as, but Cedrick Wilson can also get to that second level, get to that third level, and attack the middle of the field. So you have these perimeter threats that are growing as middle of the field threats. You have a guy like Cedrick Wilson who is a pre-built middle of the field threat that you can also use breaking towards the sideline, getting towards the outside, giving you a safe option in the flats from the slot, things like that, depending upon what type of concept you're running. And it all just meshes well. It all makes sense. And in an offense now that should be looking to have those three guys on the field, whoever are going to be their top three options, have those guys on the field together as much as possible, finding all of these ways early for them to blend, fit, and complement one another, that really helps to move your progress along pretty quickly at the position. And I know that that's something that New Orleans Saints are very interested in doing. And of course, Cedrick Wilson wants to be a big part of what the team is doing. Remember, and I always mention this, but Cedrick Wilson is the only player this offseason that the New Orleans Saints brought in as a free agent that didn't get a one-year deal. He's the only one that got longer than a one-year deal. Not Chase Young, not Willie Gay, not Will Harris. It was Cedrick Wilson. And now we're seeing him quickly rise to the top as the third option behind Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed at wide receiver. Now let's see if he can hang on to it as this offense continues to get more and more comfortable day by day. Coming up next, I want to take a look at the offensive line and the defensive line. We finally saw some rotation on the offensive line, and things on the defensive line look to have a pretty good logic behind them. Let's break it all down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is the same formula that helps you keep your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything that you need to level your car up to peak performance. Whether you're looking for superchargers, roof racks, LED headlights, exhaust kits, and more, you're going to be able to find it over at ebaymotors.com. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You're going to be able to find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts that you want at the prices that you need, you're going to be able to find exactly what you need to take your car up to MVP level performance and start to bring home those huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive today at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply, and eBay Guarantee Fit available only to U.S. customers. All right, family. For the first time here in training camp, the New Orleans Saints offensive line with the first team finally saw some rotation and some changes. Does that mean that the Saints are comfortable, or does that mean that they're still exploring their options? We'll break it down here as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, recapping day 3 of New Orleans Saints training camp. Remember, we will be live later on today, recapping day 4 from UC Irvine, and you have a fresh episode as well on Sunday. Even though the Saints are off on Sunday, I also have an episode for you that morning, breaking things down further. We're typically kind of splitting up all of our practice observations and everything like that over the course of 2 episodes, just to make things a little bit more digestible. So I'm not just sitting here like screaming a bunch of different notes at you that aren't connected to one another. I like to tell the story. So I want to tell the story of the New Orleans Saints offensive line as we continue on with today's show. We'll look at the defensive line as well. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us your first listen. Don't forget to go and check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 stream. Tua Tagovailoa got the richest 4-year deal in NFL history, only 6 hours later. Jordan Love to get it. So if you want to hear more about that and all the big stories around the NFL, make sure you're going and checking out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 stream, which you can find on Locked On Sports Today's YouTube page and on the free Amazon Fire TV channels apps, all a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So here's the story of the New Orleans Saints offensive line. There are 2 incumbent starters, and then there are 3 positions that are up for grabs. Or maybe that's only 2. We know that center Erik McCoy is firmly implanted as the starting center for the New Orleans Saints, one of the best centers in the league, and he's going to be the New Orleans Saints starting center for a long time. Cesar Ruiz firmly implanted at right guard. So the spots that have been open, left tackle, right tackle, and left guard. But it feels like left tackle might already be set, or at least Taliese Fuaga is, right? First round selection for the New Orleans Saints here in the 2024 NFL Draft. Of course, you want that guy on the field. Now, the same can be said for Trevor Penning, who was a first round selection a few years ago, but obviously things are kind of changing and moving when it comes to him. So what we saw today for the first time after 2 days of no rotation on the Saints offensive line, when it comes to team drills, on Friday, we finally saw some changes at left guard as well as at right tackle, which are both open spots. And Dennis Allen even acknowledged as such before training camp kicked off, saying that there are spots up for grabs on the offensive line. Now, the typical lineup for New Orleans that they've relied on the first 2 days of team drills was Taliese Fuaga at left tackle, Nick Saldiveri at left guard, Cesar Ruiz at center, Erik McCoy at center, Cesar Ruiz at right guard, and then Trevor Penning at right tackle. But on a couple of occasions, we saw Landon Young move in at right tackle, and we saw Lucas Patrick move in at left guard. The reason why I think that this is important is because they've been moving Landon Young around quite a bit. Let's start with him. On some rundowns, he's played over on the left side. On some passing downs, he's played over on the right side. But this was the first time that we really saw him kind of move into starting right tackle, quote unquote, if you will, right? First team right tackle. Then you look at Lucas Patrick, who has a lot of veteran experience. Even though Nick Saldiveri has sort of been the guy that has been most firmly set at left guard, the Saints end up moving him out, moving Lucas Patrick in, and then having Lucas Patrick play there. Now, Lucas Patrick has played at center, at right guard, at left guard throughout his NFL career. He is an interior movement type of guy. I think Sinio Calamete type maybe might ring a bell. So when you look at where that offensive line could be, right, another option for it would be Taliese Fuaga at left tackle, Lucas Patrick at left guard, your incumbents at center and right guard, and then Landon Young at right tackle. I'm pretty okay with that. I mean, look, Landon Young is the familiar face to where if things don't work out with Trevor Penning, it feels logical that they return to Landon Young. In fact, they have. He started multiple games last year at right tackle in place of Ryan Ramczyk when he was out with injury and then shut down at the end of the season. I don't mind the idea of a Lucas Patrick at left guard because of all that veteran experience that he has. But the big question that I'm curious about, and that hopefully we'll start to get the answer to, especially when pads go on Monday, is did the Saints move Trevor Penning off of right tackle and move Nick Saldiveri off of left guard because they felt good about them and just wanted to get a look at a couple of other guys, Landon Young and Lucas Patrick? Or was it about, you know what, let's get a look at some other options, right? Like those two have very different vibes, big time different vibes. So I think that the most telling practice is going to be Monday's padded practice. The Saints will practice again today on Saturday. Then they'll have a day off on Sunday. And then they go to those padded practices on Monday. And one of the things we'll talk about in Monday morning show is why that is important for this offensive line. But I do think that whoever is the first team offensive line to start those padded practices gives you a good idea of whose job is set, basically like whose job it is to lose in terms of where they're set. I think that's going to be a very telling day. We'll talk more about that on Monday morning, but I would say that even today, if you hear that the Saints are rotating their offensive line a little bit more, I wouldn't walk away from it with any full takeaways about anybody struggling or anybody being firmly implanted just yet. I think we'll figure that out a little bit more on Monday. We'll revisit that Monday morning. I want to look at the defensive line real quick. The Saints defensive line is going to be seeing a lot of different rotations, especially on the first team when Chase Young is more available. Chase Young has not yet moved into team drills, but he has taken some time in walkthroughs, rolling in place of Cam Jordan, rolling in place of Carl Granderson. We haven't really seen a lot of the quote-unquote NASCAR package just yet. I think we'll see that a little bit more as training camp rolls along. Just for kind of comparison, we didn't really even see nickel sets up until these last couple days. So it's one of those things where you're trying to add a little bit more, and you're installing different things at different times. Like the Saints will eventually get to third down work, and that's probably a place where you're going to see that NASCAR package. You also see what we call the Okie front, which is that 3 down linemen, 2 linebackers in the A gap, and then the 2 safeties over on the outside. When we talk about A gap, by the way, we're just talking about either side of the center on from the defensive perspective. And so I think that we'll see a little bit more of that. But what we've been seeing so far is Cam Jordan over the right tackle, Carl Granderson over the left tackle. We've been seeing, of course, Colin Saunders at the 1 tech, and then Nathan Shepard at what we would call the 3 tech. The 1 tech lines up in the A gap between the center and the guard, and then the 3 tech lines up in the B gap between the guard and the tackle. That's basically what you're looking for on the opposite side. So with that front, that's basically what we saw last year. Then you get into the second team rotation, which I think is really interesting because we've seen Peyton Turner on one side, we've seen Isaiah Foskey on the other, and then on the interior, we've seen Christian Boyd at 1 tech, and then Brian Brzee at 3 tech. The thing about the defensive line that I think is really, really different than the offensive line is that the defensive line is going to be more actively rotated in season. You're not going to rotate your offensive line in season, right? The defensive line is going to be more actively rotated. And so first team, second team, by the time that you get to the regular season, it's not that it doesn't matter, but it's going to be more about who's best against the run. Who's best against the run in this spacing, right? On the 1st and 10, the spacing is different than a 3rd and 1, right? So because of that, you're going to see a lot of different things to where sometimes you're going to see Nathan Shepard starting at 3 tech. Other times you're going to see Brian Brzee get the first snap at 3 tech, and then immediately come off the field for Nathan Shepard on 2nd down, for instance, and things like that. So who gets the start or who are the starters? Everybody on the defensive line is kind of a starter in a way. So I wouldn't get too hung up on that in terms of like what that means towards the end of towards the regular season, first team, second team. But it does give a pretty good look at how the Saints have things lined up so far. And then it's going to be really interesting to see how Chase Young shakes all that up. So there's your update on what the offensive line and the defensive line have looked like so far. We're going to learn a lot more on both of these units on Monday's padded practice. Cannot wait to get to that. Coming up next, I want to tell you a little bit about my conversation with Derrick Foster, New Orleans Saints running back coach, who has a very clear vision about how it is that he likes to coach and lead, and how it is that he likes to install drills that will immediately translate to what players are seeing on the field. We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. If you own a small business and you're hiring, you know how that process can be exhausting in some cases. Extensive, busy, you got enough going on. But you also want to make sure you're finding the right hire that fits your culture, that fits the requirements that you need for your job position as well. And that's where LinkedIn Jobs is here to help, because they're going to help you find the right professional for your team faster and for free. Over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other job sites. You're getting a very, very good look at the people that are going to be best for you and that are also actively looking for positions that you are looking to fill. The road goes both ways, so take advantage of it by heading over to LinkedIn Jobs. 86% of small businesses end up getting a qualified candidate within 24 hours of posting their job. Hire professionals like a professional over at LinkedIn. You can post your job for free today at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. I spoke with running back coach Derrick Foster, and I just simply love his approach to coaching and love his approach to the game. So I wanted to share a little bit about my conversation with him, which will give you a little bit of a glimpse into how training camp is kind of working as well and how he approaches this. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being here. Don't forget, we are your team every day. Later on today, we'll be live from UC Irvine recapping day 4 of New Orleans Saints training camp, the final day before the day off, which then leads into padded practices. You'll have a fresh episode Sunday morning as well with more breakdowns from day 3, and then another episode Monday morning kind of previewing those padded practices, who are going to be the players that are most impacted by that. And one of those positions, just to give you a little bit of a heads up about it, and you know the offensive line and defensive line, but I think running back is another position that is kind of underrated in terms of how it's impacted by those padded practices, in terms of outlook, really getting the opportunity to see how effective a running back is in the scheme and all these other things, especially in this offense, which is this wide zone offense that's predicated in the run game. We really don't get an opportunity to evaluate the run game in its full potential until we get to those padded practices. And even that is full potential for training camp, right? Full potential for training camp is different than full potential for joint practices, which is different than full potential for games. Those are all going to be different sort of, grading metrics, right? Or grading rubrics, depending upon where you are on the process. But in speaking with Derrick Foster, I got a really good glimpse into how it is that he likes to build out his practices. I spoke a few days ago and I shared some clips on social media about how the Saints have been using these sort of red gates that are probably about 7 foot tall that you can easily run under. They're called chutes, is what they're called. And so they lined up 3 of them next to one another. And then that way these running backs could start running full steam ahead. And then 2 coaches will fill 2 of the 3 gaps. And then the running back has to read that and react to it by running through the open gap. And you're trying to do this full speed, no hesitation, not worrying about patience at the line of scrimmage or anything like that. You're really working on the mentality of running through and understanding, okay, they're there, I'm going to go here. They're there, I'm going to go here. This gap is open, I'm going there, all these other things. So what is interesting to me about that is the reason, is the why behind it. So when I asked Derrick Foster about it, I wanted to know, why is this a drill that you're doing? And look, it's easy to say, well, that's how running backs run. They have to have vision. They have to understand, like, when a gap is open, you shoot that gap. When those gaps are not open, you don't run into those. You don't run towards those defenders. But I think it's, we've seen a lot of coaches just kind of teach those principles. The thing that was different was actually having literal gaps for them to run through and having literal gaps fill in front of them as they're running full steam ahead. So when I spoke with Derrick Foster about it, one of the things that he told me was, I want to create drills that translate directly to what players are doing on the field. He wants to imitate the experience of what happens on the field as closely as they can, so that when they are doing these drills, they turn around and they get to the game, and then everything kind of feels familiar. Now, it's very different, obviously, when you're trying to read bodies and shoot these gaps and things like that, but as opposed to these shoots and these coaches that are filling these gaps. But this is something that immediately translates to the game, right? Immediately translates to the game. And if this sounds familiar, especially if you're an everydayer, it's because we've had conversations like this before with tight end coach Clancy Brown, who cycles through his his practices differently than other coaches. Other coaches, what they'll do is that they'll have you come together, and if you're a tight end, you're going to work on this receiving drill, this pass catching drill. All right, everybody run through and do this. Okay, cool. Now we're going to go to this blocking drill. Everybody run through and do this a few times. Okay, now that we've hit that number, we're going to jump over to, run blocking drill. Or I already said that, but pass blocking drill, so on and so forth. And so you work on this. Then when you're done working on that, you move to the next thing. Then when you're done working on that, you move to the next thing. But the Clancy Brown does it is that you'll do a pass catching drill, and then right after that, jump to a run blocking drill. And then right after that, jump to a route running drill. And then right after that, jump to a pass blocking drill and everything. And so you're just jumping from one to the other, which more closely simulates what you're doing in a game. You're not just going to run a bunch of run plays for one drive and then come back and run only passing plays for one drive and then run only routes for the next drive and things like that, right? You're going to have a run play. Then you're going to have a pass block, a passing play, but the tight end is pass blocking, not running the route. Then they'll go back to a running play. Then they're going to run a route. So it simulates a little bit more what the rhythm of a game might feel like. And this is Derrick Foster's version of that. Here's how to shoot a gap. Here's how to see it open. The other thing that I really liked was that was on Tuesday. Yeah, that was camp day 1. On Wednesday, they came back and they only had 2 shoots, right? So instead of 3, they only had 2. And they introduced a handoff. The mesh point is what it's called, where the quarterback meets, where the ball is being handed off by the quarterback and it meets the take, if you will, or the arms of the running back. That's called the mesh point. So they introduced that, and then they had only 2 gaps. And so then they would do the handoff, and then a coach would fill one of the gaps, and then the running back who's running full steam ahead after having received the handoff, looking down to looking up, then has to go to the open gap. Why did they do this? Because in the first practice day, there was something that didn't go well on one of the inside runs. So he took away a shoot and he said, okay, let's work on the inside concepts. And then had them run through it with the handoff, introducing all of it. I asked him why he does this, right? Introducing the handoff in particular was intriguing to me because it was like, hey, everyone knows how to take a handoff. Why work that? It's an obvious question, right? It's fundamentals. But for me, the thing that was really interesting was the way that he drew the parallel to a layup line before a game in the NBA. Free throws in a game before a game in the NBA, or working on that in practice and things like that. These fundamental things that we all take for granted sometimes have to be worked, right? It might be boring to go up there and lay up, do a bunch of layups, do a bunch of layups, do a bunch of layups, shoot a bunch of free throws, shoot a bunch of free throws, shoot a bunch of free throws. But it's imperative that you know these fundamentals, that you're comfortable with these things, that these actions are in your body. And that's what they're doing with these inside zone run work, this outside zone run work, shooting these gaps, all these other things. The other thing I thought was so interesting. Oh, and by the way, like I made the connection and comparison between Derrick Foster and his idea of simulating a game in practice and Clancy Barone simulating a game in practice. The reason why I make that comparison as well is because Clancy Barone's the only offensive position coach that was retained from 2023 into 2024. So clearly something works because they kept Clancy Barone around. Now, Clancy Barone also has a phenomenal, legendary resume, having coached a bunch of Hall of Famers throughout his time. Don't get me wrong. But when you have a guy that was one of the few to make that bridge, Alvin Kamara talked about all these people that disappeared over the course of the offseason. Clancy Barone was not one of them. And so you see a practice like that of trying to simulate the game or the flow of a game in practice. And then you see a guy like Derrick Foster show up in his first year as a New Orleans Saints running back coach and then bring a similar style. I think that means something. It tells you what the New Orleans Saints are liking. The other thing that I really enjoyed, and to wrap up on this conversation, I'm going to have more on this over at Saints News Network because I love writing these pieces and talking a little bit about how these coaches work. But one of the things that I really enjoyed from him too is when I asked him, like, what is it about you that is unique to you as a coach? Not in comparison to others, but like, what does Derrick Foster's coaching look like? And he talked about individual, like being himself and asking that of his players as well. You ain't got to be nothing else but who you are. Let's play to your strengths. Huge. Big. Because you can think about a lot of times last year where the Saints did not successfully play to the strengths of their team. The other thing is he listens. He knows sometimes I learn, quote, Derrick Foster, learns as a coach because of the players that are on the field actually doing the things that the players are doing. The other thing that he said that I really loved is that I try to be the coach that I wish that I had, or I try to be the coach that was the coach that I loved when I played. And so he's doing that for his players. Just an awesome guy. I can't wait to speak more with him, but I just thought this was really good insight into what it's like to watch the work that's being done. All right, y'all, we appreciate you very much for being here. Don't forget, we'll be back with you later on today, live from UC Irvine, covering day 4 of New Orleans Saints training camp. Until then, if you're looking for a second listen, make sure you go and check out our friends, Locked On Pelicans and Locked On LSU. Check in and see what's going on all around Locked On Louisiana. We appreciate you very much, as always. Make us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media, at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know what the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.